This is Argentina, a beautiful country with one of the saddest and also the weirdest hyperinflation stories ever. Imagine living in a country where prices of goods change drastically every single hour, where your life savings lose their value overnight, where you have to cope with shortages of basic necessities and rampant unemployment. This is what millions of Argentines have experienced over and over again for the past 80 years, as the country has suffered from chronic and multiple recurrent episodes of hyperinflation. From 1944 to today, Argentina averaged around 200% inflation rate per year, reaching as high as 20,000% at its peak. These numbers are on the low side, by the way, as it's common knowledge among economists and the Argentine people that they often turn economic data from science to art, if you know what I mean. And this is the weird thing about inflation in Argentina. It never ends. Usually, even the worst hyperinflation case ever can be solved with a massive regime change, introducing a new currency, and a well-thought-out plan of monetary and fiscal budgeting. 1946 Hungary, for example, had an inflation rate of 41.9 quadrillion %, and prices of food and daily necessities were doubling every 15 hours. Yet, after they introduced a new currency, fixed the exchange rate, and did some massive monetary and fiscal policy reforms, prices stabilized and the economy fully recovered within a few years. To this day, Hungary had never experienced another hyperinflation. But in Argentina's case, whatever they've done for the past 80 years simply doesn't work. From 1955 to 1975, Argentina had a turbulent time as they had several military coups and constant civil unrest. The economy suffered from low growth, the inflation rate was at 683% at its peak, and they had lots of foreign-denominated debt. As conditions became even worse and the people grew restless, a new military dictatorship took charge in 1976 that tried to change things for the better. And at first, it did get better with inflation dampened, growth was higher, and foreign investors were looking to invest in the country once again. But starting in 1983, things went downhill for Argentina. From 1983 to 1989, the country experienced hyperinflation of around 3,000%, reaching 20,000% at its peak. All the people basically lost faith in the economy. The rich, in an effort to protect their wealth, moved their money out of the country, with the poor struggling and starving as prices went wild for 6 long years. From 1990 onwards, the situation actually became better again as a new regime took place, and they've done some massive radical reforms that saw the Argentine peso peg 1-to-1 with the US dollar. This system was extremely successful at first, as inflation in Argentina went from 3,000% to less than 5% within 5 years. I'll explain the mechanism of this in detail later in the video, but in the end, that system failed as well, with Argentina literally went bankrupt in 2001 with a mountain of debt totaling $132 billion. It was also in this period that Argentina had 5 different presidents in the span of 2 weeks. The situation was just that chaotic. Fast forward to 2014, Argentina defaulted on its debt again after a legal dispute with its creditors. Inflation hovered around 20 to 40% ever since. The country defaulted on its debt yet again in 2020, and as of recording in 2023, inflation in Argentina has passed 100% once again. This is the 80 years of Argentina's economic history in 4 minutes. An economic crisis and hyperinflation led to social unrest and a regime change. That regime will do things differently and the situation will initially get better. But as time went on, it will go back to its usual settings, rinse and repeat. So how, and more importantly why, does hyperinflation in Argentina cannot seem to go away? What seems to be the fundamental problems for Argentina's chaotic economic conditions over the last 80 years? And what can we learn from this unusual case of Argentina for our own economies? Okay. So the first turbulent era of Argentina's economy came in 1955 all the way to 1975, 20 years of economic and political instability. This, by the way, symbolizes a drastic fall of Argentina from before World War II. It might sound crazy, but before 1945, Argentina was one of the richest countries on Earth. In 1913, for example, its income per capita was higher than that of France, Italy, and Spain. And its abundant and fertile land allowed Argentina not only to produce large quantities of food, but also become the haven for immigrants looking to make a living for themselves. Believe it or not, Argentina had a reputation for being a prosperous and progressive country that offered a high standard of living and social mobility for immigrants and their families, kind of like the American dream before the American dream. But fast forward to the 1970s, Argentina had fallen to a middle-income country that experienced economic crisis after crisis. So why does this happen? Well, there are several causes for the crisis that started in 1955. First of all, Argentina's economic policy has shifted from a liberal and open model to that of a protectionist one. For example, Argentina implemented an import substitution policy. Basically, this means that Argentina will import fewer goods from other nations and try to make those goods themselves in an effort to be self-sufficient and not to be dependent on other countries. This has its benefits and drawbacks. While the policy did reduce the dependency of Argentina on other countries, especially as tensions between countries were high during World War II and the Cold War, the policy also isolated Argentina from technological innovation that could improve the productivity and competitiveness of Argentina's economy. We can see this clearly as Argentina began moving on from the agricultural sector, which has been its main source of growth and income, to the industrial sector, which benefited massively from the import substitution policy. The government provided massive funds for building out factories and hiring more workers. Imports were highly taxed so that domestic companies were protected from competition, and state-owned companies got cheap land, loans with low interest rates, not to mention massive tax breaks. This all sounds pretty good, and moving on from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial-based economy has seen much success in many other countries. But Argentina is an exception to that. Because these industrial companies have no competition both from domestic and foreign companies, producers in Argentina had little to no pressure to produce and meet customer preferences or standards. The quality and variety of the products were bad, and they had no incentive whatsoever to upgrade the quality of their products. As a result, the industrial sector became dependent on subsidies and protection from the state to survive and grow. Without these policies, many industries would become unprofitable. So the government really had to spend more and more resources to keep these companies alive. But you might think, why didn't the government just stop spending money on these burdensome companies? Well, it isn't as easy as that because these industrial companies had massive political power and they lobbied the government to spend even more money for them, like buying raw materials and providing loans. The burden of supporting these industrial companies was so great that the Argentine government had to take on a ton of debt from foreign banks and eventually print more money to finance all of its deficits. To illustrate how much deficits Argentina had back then, in 1946, Argentina had a trade deficit of $72 million, but in 1952, that deficit had ballooned to $1.2 billion, a 17 times increase in just 6 years. The trade deficit ballooned because the country's protectionist policies reduced Argentina's exports of agricultural products while also increasing the imports of raw materials and industrial goods. These deficits were mostly financed by foreign debt. For example, Argentina had a total of $1 billion worth of foreign debt in 1945. 10 years later, in 1955, that number has tripled to $3 billion. The balance of payment problem also reduced much of Argentina's foreign exchange reserves, which was one reason for them to print more money to make up for it. This resulted in excess demand for goods and services that exceeded the productive capacity of the economy. As a result, prices rose rapidly and inflation became chronic. In the 1950s, inflation hovered around 40 to 50%, and the real value of the peso depreciated by more than 80% between 1946 to 1955. Now, the next 20 years of Argentina's history were marked by political instability, social unrest, economic suffering, and numerous military coups. President Juan Perón, I'm sorry if I pronounced the name wrong, was overthrown in 1955 by those that opposed his authoritarian and interventionist regime. Then President Arthur Frondizi took over in 1958. He imposed his anti-Perón policy and tried a stabilization program. The plan kinda worked as domestic production increased, especially oil, and exports also increased. but it failed to control inflation and debt. 4 years later, in 1962, he was ousted by a military coup. Then President Arturo Illia tried reversing some of the privatization and concessions made by the regime before him. Long story short, the plan did reduce inflation and foreign debt, but also slowed down economic growth and investment. 4 years later, in 1966, he was overthrown in another military coup. Now, it will be too long to describe all of the disasters during this time because there were just that many, but I think you get the idea that 1955 to 1975 was a chaotic time for Argentina. Okay, so in 1976, economic conditions were at an all-time low as inflation reached 683%, and after yet another military coup, a military dictatorship took over the country and pursued a neoliberal economic policy opposite that of Juan Perón. The new regime deregulated markets, privatized state-owned companies, reduced tariffs, and cut social spending. Now, I said earlier at the beginning that after a dictatorship took over in 1976, things got better for Argentina, at least for a little while. I don't know if you remember it, but I kind of lied there. You see, while the dictatorship was able to attract foreign investment to the oil and gas industries and modernize the economy in some areas, I know that sounds unbelievable in the dictatorship. The damaging things that they did was much worse and led to probably one of the worst periods for Argentina since the Industrial Revolution. At first, the economic program from the dictatorship did yield some positive results. Inflation was down from 300% to 100% in 1980, which is good, considering that at the time, the world was experiencing the 1979 oil crisis thanks to the Iranian Revolution, which saw oil prices rose drastically. And economic growth began to turn positive after years of negative growth. But over time, the negative consequences of the dictatorship policy began to show up. They borrowed so much money from abroad in order to finance all of its spending. For instance, its foreign debt increased from 9.7 billion in 1976 to 45 billion in 1983. Even worse, most of these debts was contracted at variable interest rates, sensitive to international liquidity and fluctuations in interest rates. Now, of course, when a country didn't have enough income to finance its needs, perhaps taking on debt is justified to keep the country running. Even in our lives as an individual, it is okay to take on debt to finance your consumption, providing that you can spend the money wisely and pay them back. But in Argentina's case, that money wasn't even spent wisely at all, and the Falklands War was a prime example of this. In 1982, Argentina waged war against the United Kingdom over 2 British territories in the Falklands, with one of the main motives for this war being to mobilize the long-standing patriotic feelings of the Argentine people and diverting attention away from severe economic issues that it was facing. And not only the war ended in a humiliating defeat for Argentina, but it also led to another economic crisis as the debt burden was so high due to the massive cost of waging a war. Inflation became a real problem again, not to mention, the country was plagued by corruption and fragmentation between state institutions. The country lacks a clear direction, and it was so obvious even to the common people. Protests and strikes happened often during the dictatorship era, but being a dictatorship, those protests were brutally repressed. During the dictatorship era, an estimated 9,000 people to 30,000 people disappeared. And in 1983, as the economic collapse and public discontent was at an all-time high, the military dictatorship ended as Argentina moved to democracy. Many members of the military dictatorship are still in prison today. But even with democracy, things didn't get any better in Argentina. All of the problems I described before persisted, especially as inflation reached 3,000%. There were riots as stores and supermarkets across Argentina were looted due to hyperinflation and food shortages, which claims the lives of 14 people. And an interesting fact that I found out, only 30,000 people out of 30 million people in Argentina paid any income taxes in 1989. And per capita income in 1990 was essentially the same as in 1960, 30 years of backward progress. Okay, so in 1991, fed up with all of this crisis and hyperinflation, Argentina designed a bold plan to end hyperinflation once and for all. They used the currency board system. A currency board system is a type of fixed exchange rate system where the domestic currency is backed by a foreign reserve currency at a fixed rate. In Argentina's case, they pegged the Argentine peso to the US dollar in a 1-to-1 parity. Not only that, but the government established full convertibility of pesos to the US dollar, meaning that anyone who holds pesos can exchange them for US dollars without any restrictions or limitations. This also meant that the Central Bank of Argentina must have enough foreign reserve to back up all of the pesos in circulation and to satisfy the demands for US dollars. Now, the system worked really well as inflation dropped from 3,000% in 1989 to less than 5% in 1994. So, why did it work? First of all, it eliminated the possibility of printing more money if the central bank do not have the required amount of US dollar. The Central Bank of Argentina was required to hold at least $1 US for every peso it issued. Or in other words, the money supply could not exceed the level of foreign reserves. With this mechanism in place, people don't need to worry about money printing causing hyperinflation anymore, so it restored confidence in the economy. It also promotes monetary discipline to the nation, as it cannot carelessly print its way out of trouble, which has been a bad habit for the past century. The fact that you can easily swap pesos for the US dollar also meant that people are more willing to own pesos, as to before, when nobody wants to own an Argentine peso as its value fluctuated massively every single day. All of this promotes the view that the Argentine peso is now credible, stable, and the central bank is disciplined in managing the money supply, and the effects of it were immediately seen. I've said before that inflation dropped from 3,000% to less than 5% in 5 years, but GDP growth also increased from -2% in 1990 to 8% in 1997. From 1992 to 1999, the value of exports increased by 8.2% per year on average, while employment increased by 12%. And for about 8 years, Argentina became a stable economy again, with many people and institutions like the IMF praising the currency board system. But all good things must come to an end. And in 2002, Argentina abandoned the currency board system despite it being extremely successful. And that's because the currency board system had many risks. First of all, the US dollar actually appreciated in value massively when compared to other major currencies in the 1990s. And while a strong dollar might be good for the USA, it certainly didn't for Argentina. This is because as Argentina maintained its 1-to-1 peg, the Argentine peso became overvalued, which caused Argentina's goods to be more expensive in the international market. Argentina's economy depended a lot on agricultural and industrial exports, so it's a major blow for the country. This problem is actually a lot bigger than it sounds when we consider that Brazil, Argentina's main competitor in exports, devalued its currency by 40% in 1999 in response to its financial crisis, making Brazilian goods much cheaper and more attractive to the international market, while Argentina's goods became more expensive. This caused Argentina to lose its market share and trade balance. Another problem was that the currency board system prevented Argentina's central bank from conducting independent monetary policy, which is always a problem in any fixed exchange regime. This meant that Argentina had to follow the US monetary policy, two countries with different economic cycles. For example, when the US raised interest rates in 1994 by 75 basis points, Argentina had to do the same, even though it was in a period of recession. This increased the cost of borrowing and reduced domestic demand and investment in Argentina at a time when they needed to get out of recession. So, that's just going to make it even worse. Conversely, when the US lowered interest rates in 1998, Argentina had to do the same even though it was already suffering from an overvalued exchange rate and low competitiveness, a wasted policy. And by this point, you should already realize that Argentina had a chronic addiction to taking foreign debt, and when Argentina lost its export competitiveness over Brazil in 1999, then they have to take on even more debt to be able to cover the deficits. Also, the fact that so few people pay taxes in Argentina didn't help the situation at all. The country's external debt increased from about 30% of GDP in 1991 to over 50% of GDP in 2001, most of them in US dollars with very high interest rates, as Argentina had a big reputation for defaulting on its debts. No sane investor was willing to buy Argentina's government bonds without a huge risk premium, and that shows in the numbers, as the interest rates on Argentina's government bonds rose from about 7% in 1997 to over 40% in 2001. All of these factors, from the rigidity of its fixed exchange regime, the loss of competitiveness of its exports, its addiction to debt, weak tax collection, and the external shocks caused by the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the Russian default in 1998, and the Brazilian devaluation in 1999, all culminated in a perfect storm that caused Argentina to default on its debt in 2001. The country suffered another severe economic crisis and social unrest, and they were forced to abandon the currency board system, devaluing the peso. This is because Argentina's debt default broke the main pillar of the currency board system: credibility. The currency board system could function based on the promise that the government would honor its commitment to maintaining a fixed exchange rate and full convertibility between the peso and the dollar. But by defaulting on its debt, which was mostly dominated in US dollars, the Argentine government violated this commitment and signaled that it could not maintain the currency board system any longer. This led to a loss of confidence in the peso and a run on the banks by depositors who wanted to withdraw their dollars. Now, from 2002 until today, what happened with Argentina was more of the same as what we have seen before. The country recovered from 2003 to 2008, thanks to high commodity prices, especially for its main exports of soybeans and oil. Argentina also received debt relief from the Paris Club and the IMF, which helped reduce its debt burden and interest payments. According to official statistics, the poverty rate fell from 54% in 2002 to 15% in 2008, while the unemployment rate declined from 21% to 7%, and inflation between 4 to 10%. However, this was also the period when many economists and people in Argentina believed that they began turning economic data from science to art, especially the inflation rate. So, keep in mind that these figures might not be reliable. For example, unofficial estimates had Argentina's inflation rate at 25% in 2008, compared to the official estimates of 8%. Now, the global financial crisis of 2008 following the collapse of the Lehman Brothers affected Argentina as well, mainly through lower commodity prices and less global demand for Argentina's products. The GDP growth rate fell from 9% in 2007 to minus 5.9% in 2009, while the fiscal surplus turned into a deficit in 2009. The fact that people couldn't trust the official statistics anymore also eroded any belief that the citizens had towards the ruling government, making the situation become even worse. Okay, so moving on to the present day, nothing really changed. Since 2015, inflation has been pretty constant at 40 to 50%. In 2018, Argentina was hit by a severe drought that affected its agricultural exports and a sudden reversal of capital flows that triggered a currency crisis. It took yet another financial assistance from the IMF of a 44 billion loan program for them to get through. In 2019, Argentina entered a deep recession, with GDP falling by 2.1% and inflation reaching 53%. And it only got worse as the pandemic hits, which led to a strict lockdown and a collapse in domestic and external demand. In 2020, GDP fell by 9.9% and inflation rose to 63%. In 2021, Argentina's economy rebounded quite strongly from the pandemic, growing by 10.4%, thanks to the recovery of global trade, higher commodity prices, and the easing of lockdowns. However, this recovery still wasn't enough to reverse the social damage caused by the crisis. In 2021, Argentina's poverty rate increased to 46.3% and unemployment to 11%. In 2022, inflation soared to over 100%, eroding people's wages and purchasing power. The government tightened restrictions on imports and intervened in the foreign exchange market to preserve its reserves, if they still have any, and to avoid a devaluation of the peso. These measures really hampered economic activity, leading to a fall in GDP by 1.5%. In 2023, Argentina's economy is projected to only grow by 0.5%. Another severe drought has reduced its agricultural output, inflation is expected to remain high and volatile, And the fiscal situation is also precarious, as their tax revenues are far from enough to cover the spending needs and debt obligations. It's not looking good. Now, if we look back at the past 80 years of Argentina's economy, it's really hard to pinpoint the causes of all of the crises that have happened so far. But I would argue that it's a combination of absolutely poor fiscal discipline, the expectations of inflation among the people, and ineffective policies. First of all, Argentina has been running large budget deficits for many years, which means it spends more than it earns. To finance these deficits, it either borrows money from foreign creditors or prints more money, both of which increase inflation. One great econ paper that I've read while researching for this video actually described the Argentine government as a chronic alcoholic, in which deficit spending is the alcohol. Once it tastes the alluring pleasure of debt, it keeps on going until it reaches the economic state of being entirely wasted. Of course, it doesn't help that Argentina had 6 military coups in the 20th century that disrupted the continuity of economic policies. Every regime seems like it wanted to do something entirely different than the regime before. They had left-wing leaders, right-wing leaders, democracy, dictatorship, nothing of which seemed to have worked. They all have tried various policies to contain inflation, such as price controls, subsidies, exchange rate controls, and monetary reforms. But all of these policies often proved to be ineffective or counterproductive, as they distorted market signals, created shortages, generated black market opportunities, or are only a short-term fix that didn't solve the underlying problem at all. Also, inflation is not only a matter of supply and demand, but also of expectations. When people expect inflation to be high, they demand higher wages and prices, which creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Argentina has a very long history of hyperinflation, which eroded people's trust in the government and the currency. As a result, people tend to hoard dollars or other assets as a hedge against inflation, while the Argentine peso is treated like plague. So, while there are lots of factors on why Argentina's economy is as it is today, in my humble opinion, its addiction to deficit spending, inept and unstable government, and inflation expectations are the three main factors that shape Argentina's economy for the last 80 years. If Argentina wants to go back to its early glories, these three big problems will need to be solved one way or another. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.